So I am grateful that we can formally begin the symposium. And so now we will watch the recording of the interview between Merlin Burt and Jim Nix.
Symposium. I realize that this meeting is being held online. Years ago, when we started this symposium, it was for the purpose of exploring ways of understanding Ellen White from faith context. And I have now moved to the General Conference and am working with the Ellen G. White estate. And I feel great privilege today to be able to meet with my friend, former boss, and to a real degree a mentor in my experience, Elder Jim Nix, who is now retired. He was director of the Ellen G. White estate for the last 20 years and has actually worked for a period of more than 48 years. If you take his actual time, it's a little over 49 years in the area of Ellen White and Adventist history. And we're just going to talk together and discuss some about his story, his life, his experiences, which I think will be a blessing for many who are listening. I know it'll be a blessing for me. But before we do that, I'd like to begin with a word of prayer. Let's bow our heads. Loving Father, we thank you so much for Jesus. We thank you for his love. We thank you for his testimony that he has given through the gift of prophecy. And we thank you for the way in which you have revealed your love through the writings and the ministry of Ellen White. And we would ask that today, this morning, as we talk together, as we consider together, that you would bless both Jim and I, and that you would bless those who are listening, that our hearts would be knit together with you and connected to you in a new way because of the memories and the thoughts that we share. Thank you so much. In our Savior Jesus' name, I pray. Amen. Well, Jim, it's been a pleasure to work with you for quite a number of years.
And let's be careful about how many.
we'll not overemphasize that. And we have had many research trips together, looking for early Adventist sites. We've worked on projects together. Many times I've been following your lead, and I've appreciated it so much. We've had tours together, long stories that we could talk about our experience. But what we'd like to do today is to just hear a little bit of your recollection of your experiences down through the years, of things that I think our hearers would be interested in knowing about. And one of the things that people have appreciated so much over the years, and I know I have appreciated them, is the several interviews that you had with family members of Ellen White, her grandchildren, and then others who knew her, who interacted with her, maybe were even friends with her. And so maybe we could just talk a little bit about, for a few minutes here, a little bit here in this interview, some of your memories of those interviews. I believe one of your early interviews, maybe the first, was with Alma McKibben. Could you just talk a little bit about that story of how that happened?
Let me tell you about how it happened. I was a student at what was then La Sierra College in Riverside, California, and we had a week of prayer speaker, Dr. Lewis, or Pastor Lewis Venden. And in the course of one of his talks, he mentioned that he was pastor of the Mountain View, California church, which is where the Pacific Press was in those days. And he said on Sabbath, there was an elderly lady that was a member of his congregation. On Sabbath, as he was preaching, she would sit in the congregation going like this. And once in a while, she'd go like this. And he said he knew when she went like this that he had made some kind of a theological blunder, And it would serve him well to have a pastoral visit with her. I don't remember exact wording, but to go see her that following week to find out how he had goofed in his theology that he had been preaching. And then in passing, he said, and she knew Ellen White and Jane Loughborough and S.N. Haskell. He may have mentioned a few others. I don't remember. Those are the names I recall after all these years. I mean, this was about 1966 or 67. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know why, growing up in California, I was born in California and raised in California, it never had dawned on me that now 52 years after Ellen White's death, there would still be elderly people around that I could go talk to that remembered her. And so I decided I better go, I need to go see these people and meet them and see what they could tell me. Because I was interested in history. I was a theology major and history major, double major in college. So I remember going up to Pastor Venden. I happened to see him in the dining hall, or the commons, they called it. And he was standing over to one side. So I asked him if he had her address, if he could tell me where she lived in Mountain View. And right off the top of his head, he gave me the address. And I thought, he's been there a few times. Now, that was my irreverent sense of humor. But anyway, so I decided the next break I'd go see her, which I did. Now, to give you just a little insight into my own personality, because I'm really quite shy. I've gotten a little bit better, but I still haven't gotten completely over it. So I remember driving all the way from La Sierra up to Mountain View, California. For those that are from outside the United States and don't know where that is, Mountain View is just a few miles south of San Francisco. And maybe you've heard of that city. So I drove up there, had the address, found the place, no problem. And I remember pulling up in front of her house. And then the shyness kicked in, and I thought, I can't just walk up on this lady. I don't have an appointment. I can just knock on the door and say I want to go in. So I remember driving around the block a couple of times, trying to get over my shyness. And finally, I thought to myself, now she's 95 or 96. I've forgotten now how old she was at the time. What is she going to do to me? You know, I'm about 20 years old at the time. So I'm going to go try knocking on the door. So I go up there on the porch, and here's a sign on the door that said, Mrs. McKibben is suffering from a voice condition. Please limit your visits to, I think it was 15 minutes. It may have been 10 minutes, but anyway, very short. And I thought, well, if she knows anything and has any stories to tell, it's going to take longer than that. So I'm going to go on up to Pacific Union College, where I was going to go see my aunt and uncle and cousins. And that was the next stop on my trip. And there was this little elderly hand, right? You need to know that there was a door, the front porch, and a door, and right to the right was a large window with Venetian blinds. And between the Venetian blinds came this little hand motioning me to come in. And so I was caught, you know, I had to go in. So I went in, quite nervous, told her what I wanted. She, being a retired teacher, school teacher, actually was the first Adventist, full-time Adventist church school teacher in California. So she had a lot of experience. Anyway, I go in and tell her what I want. Oh, she was so gracious. And she began sharing her recollections of Ellen White. After we had talked for, I don't know, maybe a half an hour or longer, I said, you know, Mrs. McKibben, what I really wanted to do was I wanted to make a tape recording of you telling these stories. Would you mind? Oh, no, that would be fine. I'd be glad to do that. So I go out to the car, out to the trunk, get one of these great big, you know, I mean, if you're my age, you know what they look like. These big reel-to-reel tape recorders, and hauled it in, set it up. And she began to tell me the same stories a second time that she told the first time. And I was just enthralled as I listened to her talking about her recollections of Ellen White. So that's how I got started. And then from there, just to kind of tease that line out a little bit further, from there I did go on up to see my relatives that lived up near Pacific Union College. And I wanted there to meet Mrs. Schock, who was Ellen White's youngest granddaughter. And I had read in the Pacific Union Recorder that she and her husband had just come to Elmshaven, Ellen White's last home in Northern California there. So she's living there now with her husband. And they are the new docents, or the guides, to take visitors through Elmshaven. So I went up and talked to her for a little bit. And after we'd visited a few minutes, for any that have been there. She was living in the apartment that had been, that was in the tank house. Excuse me, not the tank house, the office building behind. She and her husband were in an apartment there. And after a little bit, she said, "You don't want to talk to me. You want to talk to my mother." I said, "What? Your mother? Willie White's second wife?" His first wife had died of tuberculosis in 1890. And this is now 1967, I think it was. So she said, "Yes, she's in a room up on the top floor of the original part of the St. Helena Sanitarium. And you need to go talk to her. She's got a lot more memories than anybody else." Well, obviously she did have, except for Ella Robinson, she did have more memories than anyone else. And so I went up to see her. She had remarried after Willie died, so she was Mrs. Corral when I knew her. Ethel May Lacey White Corral. And she wanted to make certain all that got in. So Ethel May, that was her name. She went by May. And then Lacey was her maiden name. And then, of course, White was because she'd been married to Willie White, Ellen White's son. Well, now, there was a different perspective, talking to someone who referred to Ellen White as mother. Yeah. It's not Mrs. White, it's not Sister White. It's mother, mother this, mother that, whatever she was talking about. So just to show how God kind of put things together in terms of looking back on my life, seated in that same little room up there on the top floor where Mrs. Corral had her room where she was staying, was another elderly lady, and she didn't say a word. She was just sitting there. And after a while, May said to me, "Now, there is a lady that really knows more than I do, because she remembers Ellen White farther back than I do. That's Ellen White's oldest granddaughter, Ella White." Well, she just said Ella Robinson, who was Willie White's oldest granddaughter, Ellen White's oldest granddaughter, Willie White's oldest daughter, Ellen White's oldest granddaughter. And she just happened to be visiting from Pennsylvania. So, again, just getting ahead of the story a little bit, she introduced me to Ella, and Ella found out what I wanted, and after a little bit she said, "Well, you've got it." This was over a period of little time before this part happened, but she said, "You need to come back to Washington, D.C., to the General Conference. We got to do this interview up right. And so you got to come back." And my brother, who's his brother? Well, it's Arthur White, who for 40 years was head of the White Estate, 41 years, I think, exactly, or precisely. So anyway, she said, "You got to come back there." Could you come back there? Well, I tell you, in the 1960s, at least in my family, you didn't just flit around the country quite as easily as you do now. So anyway, I worked it out to drive back there and did a recording, which the White Estate and the Ministerial Association circulated. And I still, when I listened to it, I shouldn't probably put I will. Why not? I'm retired. What's going to happen now? When I listened to it, I was so nervous. And here, Mrs. Robinson, Ella, she's an elderly lady with a high-pitched voice. And she's asking her questions, and I am so scared. I'm responding with, "Yes, Mrs. Robinson." So when I listen to it now, that tape, I'm very embarrassed. But anyway, that's how I kind of got started in all this. The Lord, looking back on it, I can see how the Lord opened doors. I didn't realize at the time how it was all going to come together in my life, but it has been such a rich experience. And my view of Ellen White is so different than many people, because though obviously I never met Mrs. White, I met several people that knew Mrs. White, others besides just members of the family. And the picture of this warm, loving person, I mean, it's just so overpowering for me to realize what a genuine person she was. And I remember one time I was interviewing Ellen White's grandson, one of her grandsons, Arthur White, and his sister Grace, that I've already mentioned, that was the caretaker at Elmshaven for several years. And I was kind of pushing him a little bit in this interview. I mean, we were doing a taped interview. And I was pushing him a little bit about, was it really as good as you're trying to paint it as being? Because, I've worked for the White Estate. I know what people think. She was this domineering, dogmatic, hard to get along with person. And so I was trying to tease him out or get him to, was she really that warm and wonderful and all that? And Arthur White got a little upset with me, and he said, "Jim, she really was. You need to believe me. She really was. It was a real privilege growing up around my grandmother." And people that didn't have that experience obviously don't see that side of her. But that's probably the strongest that anybody reacted, but then I was probably pushing him harder than anybody else. I didn't normally go around and say, did you really think she was that wonderful? But with him, I thought, now's the time. I really want to know, was she everything that he and his sister and his older half-sisters were painting her as being? And he was quite emphatic that she really was. And, people don't realize it unless they were around her.
It's incredible. I've heard so many times you tell some of the stories that they told you on tours and in various meetings, and it may be that even some of our students that are listening in this symposium have been to the Seminary Heritage Sabbath a few years ago. We didn't have it last year because
That's
of
true.
the COVID situation, but those stories have brought the ministry of Ellen White to life for literally thousands of people. And I know you just mentioned it a little bit here, the picture of Ellen White that you heard from the family. But maybe elaborate a little bit more. Is there any part of Ellen White and who she was that interfaced maybe with something you've read that just makes her more rich for you because of the interviews that you've done and the interactions that you had with her daughter-in-law and grandchildren?
Well, when you talk about the daughter-in-law, I don't have time because we only have a limited time for this recording. But one of the things that I was a college student when I first met the daughter-in-law, and I wasn't married. And here I'm sitting talking to someone who courted right under, as we would say, Ellen White's nose, so to speak. I mean, what was her reaction when she found out that Willie was interested in May? And the story, it's been written up by others, but it's an amazing story, and she got into it. I mean, I had never pictured Ellen White as a matchmaker, but once she found out that Willie had proposed to May, then, well, I'll tell you just enough of the story. He had proposed, and then as she told me, he left the next day on a trip. So he's going off to New Zealand from Australia. They were living in Australia at the time. And so he went off to New Zealand, and I don't know where else, before he got back home. But he had proposed just before he left. And so now my question is, what was Ellen White's reaction? And of course, she later married Willie, so she always referred to her as Mother, as I mentioned. But it was Mother was the best ally that Willie could have had. When I would come in, because she was a student, May was a student working at the school, and she'd come over in the afternoon and was helping to work off her school bill and stuff. So she did some stuff for Ellen White at Sunnyside, or Ellen White's home in Australia. And she said, as soon as I'd arrive, Mother would start in on me. Have you made up your mind yet? Why wouldn't you want to marry Willie? Willie would make a wonderful husband. And on she'd go. See, I never pictured that side of Ellen White. I had kind of grown up around some people, fortunately not my own family, but some people, who made it sound to me like Ellen White was kind of anti-courtship, anti-love, anti-any of that kind of stuff. And here I'm talking to somebody who has been proposed to by Ellen White's son, and I'm finding out, no, Ellen White's the opposite. She's like a lot of people. Well, have you made up your mind yet? Why wouldn't you want to marry Willie? What's going on? What's your hold up here? She didn't use it quite that language, but that was the idea. And I'm amazed, pleasantly amazed, but I'm amazed. That was not the way I pictured Ellen White at all.
And she wanted to have grandsons too.
Oh, well, that's something else. She wanted grandsons. And actually, she named the four boys when they were the grandsons, the twins, the two boys, when they were born. She named them for her four sons. So she named one of the twins Herbert Clarence White. Herbert, of course, took care of little John Herbert, the youngest, and Clarence was the father's middle name, William Clarence White. And the other one she named James Henry White. James, of course, took care of the father. Ellen White's husband,
Right.
And James Edson, son number 2, and Henry was son number 1, Henry Nichols White, the oldest. So in those two little boys, she got all 4 of her sons and her husband's name, plus May's brother's name also. He was Herbert H. Camden Lacey, Herbert Camden Lacey, Professor Lacey. So, but, I mean, that's just the kind of thing that you would expect. Well, how are we going to name these kids? Well, they didn't have names. I guess they probably didn't realize they were going to have twins back in those days. So they weren't prepared for it. So she said, well, could I name them? And they said, sure. She said, Mother wanted to know if she could name them. Yeah, we said, sure, go ahead. So that's what she came up with. And she apparently was a very warm and loving grandmother. She bought them a little wagon. They would play around Elmshaven there, hauling their little wagon and going out to dig stuff in the garden, et cetera, and put it in their wagon and haul it back for Grandma and this kind of thing. I mean, she's just a typical grandma as far as they were growing up around her. And yet they, like Grace told me, she said, we always knew that Grandma's writings were special. We knew, even though when we were very young, we didn't know all the ramifications, everything that we later learned, but we knew that she was special. And but I mean, there's another little story that I think is cute, probably a lot of people have heard, and that is after she bought Elmshaven, there was no writing room on there, and she needed a space to write. So she built a writing room on the second floor above the kitchen. And there was a little back stairway that went up into the writing room. Now, she, being busy, could not just be interrupted all the time. And people would come and they would want an interview with Ellen White. And unless you had an appointment, just don't count on it. You didn't get in. I mean, she could not just be interrupted all the time. However, she was a grandmother. And that rule was supposed to apply to the grandkids also. Don't come mess with your grandmother. Don't interrupt her. She's busy. But Grandma had her own ideas. So there was, as I mentioned, there was this little stairway that came up from downstairs by the back door up into the writing room. And they had worked out, the grandkids had worked out with their grandmother, this little sign that if they would go up that stairway, stand at the top of the stairway, look across her writing room to where she was seated in her writing chair. She would see them over there. When she got through writing the thought that she was working on, she'd lay her pen down, and that was the sign they knew. They could run across, jump up in her lap. She'd give them a big hug and a squeeze and a kiss and talk to them briefly about whatever, if there's new chickens that had hatched or whatever. I mean, she used to have some sayings, and one of them was, your name is White. You must always keep it that way. And another one that she used to tell her grandkids was, there's a heaven to win and a hell to shun. Now, those were not unique with her. That certainly was not a unique saying. But it's one that they remembered her saying to them. So anyway, they would be in there for just a few minutes, play. The lady that was in charge of the house, whose name was Miss McInturfer, Sarah McInturfer, she was the one that guarded the front door. And you didn't go in unless you had this appointment already set up. But she didn't know what was going on in the back door. So I've chuckled more than once because the grandkids and Grandma, Ellen White, they'd worked this deal out, so they just completely bypassed Sarah. She's out there in the front part of the house, protecting everything, doing whatever she's supposed to be doing, and the kids are sneaking in, the grandkids are sneaking in the back, going up the stairs, having this brief little interview. Oh, they didn't want to spend a lot of time with Grandma. They were just kids. They wanted to hug and a kiss, and they loved their grandmother, and back downstairs and out they'd go to play or whatever their assignment was if they had chores to do. And guess what? Everybody's happy. Grandma's happy. She got to see her grandkids. The grandkids are happy because they got to see their grandmother. And Sarah's happy because she doesn't know anybody has done anything, and so she thinks she's doing her job well. So it worked out for everybody.
And Ellen White had a good experience because she got to see her grandkids.
That's what I said, yeah. So she got to be with her grandkids. So she was happy. But that was typical Ellen White. She was a well-rounded person. She liked, I just read this recently in some letters. We had, we had some tapes at the White Estate that had never been transcribed, recordings of different people that had known Ellen White, that had lived around Elmshaven. And one of them, I don't remember, I didn't know I was going to tell this, but I got a chuckle when I read it. One of them was by an elderly person who had been a young person living there close to Elmshaven. And he said, well, we remembered when Sarah McInturfer and Ellen White would go riding for a buggy, and they'd go wheeling around the corners. And it sounded like both those women liked the speed. And I chuckled when I read that. I thought, well, okay. And another one recalled that when Ellen White came into church, she just marched herself right down to the front row, sat down, took her her coat off or whatever, her hat off or whatever, put it down, sat down, and she was there for church. But again, it seems like she was, she was kind of quick about it. She was not slow, and sometimes I think we picture her, and maybe because most of the stories we have of her is when she was very late in life.
Right.
But apparently that's not the way she was her whole life. She liked to go fast in her buggy, and she wasn't driving. Sarah McIntyre was driving. She had driven buggies, but by the time this person was telling his recollections, it was Sarah McIntyre who was the race driver. Well, that's my interpretation.
As you mentioned the story of them going up the back stairs, the kids, I remember I didn't know any of the grandchildren except for Grace. I was a student at Pacific Union College in the late 70s, and she was living there. And I don't know how, but for one time I went down there on a Sabbath afternoon, and I was just struck with the peace of the place there at Elms Haven. She kept the flowers up and the yard. It was beautifully done. And she was just such a kind and genuine person, speaking of Grace. And she could laugh. I mean, there was no hesitation for her laughing. And over a period of several weeks, I came to think of Ellen White as being something like Grace, because she just would talk about her. And I said, I wonder if Ellen White was somewhat like Grace.
Now, you see, I've had the same question about Grace's her older half-sister, Mabel Workman. That's who I think about. If you wanted to get me to think about how Ellen White looked, how she reacted to things, it's Mabel. Mabel was built, her body structure was very much like the pictures of Ellen White, much more so than Grace even. She had a laugh. If you got Mabel laughing, you know these kind of people where they have a deep, I call it a belly roll, I don't know, but it kind of gets going down here, and it kind of rolls up and out it comes, And that was Mabel. And everybody loved Aunt Mabel in the family. There's hardly anybody left alive that remembers Aunt Mabel now. She died about 1985 or 6, somewhere in there, I think. Anyway, but that's what I remember. That's why I picture Ellen White, is I think of Mabel because of her this warm laugh,
Yeah.
and just a loving, loving person.
And that Ellen White was so practical and reasonable. One thing that I've thought of over and over, I wish I could have recorded some of my talks with her, because I don't remember much of what we talked about. I went down for a number of weeks there. But I remember one time when I was down, she actually put me to work. I'd come down on Sunday sometimes, and I'd be working.
Good for her. That's a white trait also.
I'd be working in the garden with her, but then she'd talk with me. But I remember there was a family that came down, and the kids were not very well disciplined. Actually, this was on Sabbath, not on when I was working with her, but it was another Sabbath. And the kids were just running around. It was Sabbath afternoon. And the parents thought this was kind of like a sacred place, and they didn't want the kids to be running, and so they said, don't run, don't run. And I vividly remember Grace saying, oh, it's all right, don't worry about it. I remember when I was a little girl, and I would run around on Sabbath, and we would sometimes go on a walk, and we would run ahead, and my mother was so concerned that we were always not, doing the right thing and staying close enough. And she says, I remember I overheard Grandma telling Mother one time when we were running ahead, now, May, don't tell the children not to run, because children are going to run. Tell them something they can do, like don't get too far ahead, or don't get off the path, or something like that. And so these practical things.
Well, see, that fits in with what, I've forgotten which of the grandchildren, but one of them I was talking to one time, it may have been Ella or Grace, I don't remember, whichever one it was. But the point I'm going to make is the story that they told was, the question was, who did the disciplining? How rigid was it? And the answer was, we didn't have very many don'ts in the White family. And then there was the chuckle, the invariable chuckle. That's because we had so many do's. We were always doing things. As Grace told me once, we worked together as a family. We played together and we worked together. Or we worked together, I think she said first, and then played together. It was a family thing. So everybody would get up in the morning, go out in the garden, and then later play. Ellen White gave land when she bought Elms Haven. She gave some property so that her boys, or grandsons, not really her boys, but her grandsons, could have a ball diamond. She was not against playing ball. She was against competition, but she was not against the simple playing of ball, ball games. She also had a little piece of land where they built a playhouse for Grace. And Grace, who had these brothers, she was the only girl in the second family. Willie White had 2 daughters by his first marriage, and then his first wife died, and then he got remarried, and now he has 1 daughter and these 4 grandsons, or these 4 sons. And Grace told me the brothers, they knew they were not to come into her house, except if, I mean her little playhouse, except if she gave them permission. She was queen of that. She didn't say I'm queen, but that's the way it came across. I'm queen of this place, and when I give you permission, you can come in. However, others in the family told me everybody idolized Grace. I mean, they just doted over her. They loved her. She was a very warm person, as you know. You met her. So it was not, it wasn't a bad relationship between her brothers, but you stay out. You haven't been invited in today. This is mine. When I'm ready for you, you can come to my little playhouse. No, she didn't say that, I guess, but that was the idea.
Arthur White was director of the White Estate for longer than anyone else.
41 years.
And you have had many years as director of the White Estate, and I'm brand new at the work. What about Arthur White? Can you just say a few thoughts about him? Because there's probably many people who would not even remember who they know something about him.
Well, no, he died, 1991, as I recollect.
Yeah, so it's getting back a few years. How about just a memory or two about Arthur White?
To be honest with you, I was not around Arthur White as much as some of these others. First place, you have to realize that Arthur White was Arthur White. I mean, he had presence, at least for me, when I was in a room and he walked in, if there was some meeting going on and he came in, you knew that Arthur White had arrived. It wasn't that but he had presence. There's no question that he had presence. But I've also seen, I wouldn't be working for the White Estate today if it weren't for Arthur White, because there were some accusations made against me that were not true, and he knew they were not true, and he stuck up for me in a committee. So I'm not probably the best person to be totally objective about Arthur White, because if somebody has stuck up for you when you're a young person, this was long before I started working for the White Estate. Yeah. I was working at Loma Linda at the time before I started for the White Estate. You're going to be somewhat skewed in whatever our objective you can be in a case like that. But Arthur White was he had a long experience. He had grown up around his father, Willie White, who of course was the son of James and Ellen White, and so he had all these memories, and what he hadn't lived through, he had studied and read. So now Arthur White is the one that carries on that legacy. He had very few memories of Ellen White. In fact, when I was doing these interviews with his siblings and asked him about his memories, he said, "Jim, I really have very few memories." He was about 7 when he was 8, maybe. I guess he was 8, somewhere in there, 7 or 8, when Ellen White died. He said, "My main memories are of the funeral," which makes sense because she was around all the time. And so you don't really think much about the common. Mm-hmm. And then there's a funeral, and now everything is upset and changed. And, it's a whole different, for the time of the funeral, it's a whole different program than what you normally have had. And so he said, my main recollections are of the funeral. He didn't have very many personal recollections. So he suggested, talk to my sisters. The twins, his twin brothers, had both died before I got involved, so I didn't meet Herbert and Henry. Mm-hmm. But what can I say about Arthur White? I'll give you a little insight in the guy that maybe surprised some people that have been critical of him through the years. He retired from the White Estate and moved out to California and lived near Elmshaven in his wife's parents' house, his wife's mother's house. I don't know if both parents had ever lived there, but the old Swingle house. And so that's where he finished the 6-volume biography, was there in the Swingle house. 6-volume. Is it 6-volume?
Yeah, 6-volume.
All of a sudden I thought, was it 6 or 8,
Yeah.
6-volume biography.
They came out one by one.
Yeah, they did. They brought out the next to the last one first, and then brought out the last one second, and then went back and started the whole project from volume 1.
I was new in ministry at that time, and I remember the church, it seemed, the whole church, well, at least the church I knew, was waiting anxiously for the next volume. It was like the minute it was available, I was at the ABC and had bought it and was
devouring. And the schedule that he set up for himself, for a man who was in his 70s, one chapter a week for 40-some weeks, and then the review and the editing, and then start all over the next year. And I mean, it was grueling that he would just had this calendar, and he just kept to it.
For those of you who are listening, we're talking about the 6-volume biography of Ellen White, which is still the most extensive biography we have of Ellen White that Arthur White wrote. And I would encourage you to read that. You can look at it online at the White Estate website, Ellen White Materials, or get the paper copy. It's a wonderful read.
I don't think it's in print anymore.
Well, but they can get it online.
Oh, they can get it online, but you said get the paper copy.
Once in a while, you can find the books in a book sale or somewhere.
That's true, but
or on eBay.
But you can't just run to your ABC anymore.
They're in demand. Well, we could spend our whole time just on this, but I want to take a few minutes in the last 20 minutes.
Well, I want to tell you quickly about how he changed his mind.
Okay, go ahead.
So here he was going to do his research out there at this house just by Elmshaven, and he wanted resources out there, so I'll try to abbreviate this as much as possible. So he convinced the White Estate to send out letters and manuscripts and all kinds of stuff, and they would be put at the library at Pacific Union College, and they would have a research center. Well, I was on the Elmshaven Advisory Committee, which was working on restoring. It was called the Restoration Committee, I think. Anyway, I was on this committee that was working on the restoration of Elmshaven, and so I had gone from Loma Linda up to Pacific Union College, or to St. Helena, to this committee meeting. And I get up there, and the people at the research center, at Elmshaven, I'm trying to abbreviate too much, at Elmshaven told me about this research center, and they didn't want it, they didn't have time for it, they weren't set up, they weren't equipped, they didn't have the background. So, but Uncle Arthur White, he's determined this is what it's going to be. So they want me to get it changed. Now, here I am, half his age, and I'm supposed to talk Arthur White, who I liked him, I respected him, but I was intimidated by him, and like a lot of people were, just because of his personality, not because he'd ever done anything negative. In fact, as I said, he'd protected me and saved me from getting fired one time for something I had not done. But anyway, so I'm supposed to convince him to change his mind. So long story short was, I talked with the library director, who was at that time the library director, said, would you like this up here at the library, up at the college, on up the hill? Oh yes, he would love it. I said, well, then let's go down, make an appointment, and go down and talk to Arthur White down at Elmshaven. So we go down, we're sitting out there on the porch where you've sat. And actually that day, I think we may have been in the front room, the living room. Anyway, wherever, we went down to talk to him. And so I presented my view, and that I thought a lot more people would find it and use the materials after Arthur White was through with them if they were up in the college library. And the library director is sitting there, yes, he didn't know Arthur White, he'd seen him, but so I'm carrying the water for this one. When we get through, Elder White said, well, I hate to tell you, you should have had this conversation with me before. He said, because the stuff has already been shipped. I've had a phone call that was shipped last, Tuesday or whenever it was. So it will be showing up in the next couple of days. And and it's all addressed to come here to Elmshaven, so it's a done deal. So I was talking afterwards with the library director. I said I did the best I could. Well, he'd been sitting there, he could hear. And so, but just to show you about Arthur White. So we go to the meeting the next day or 2 days later, whenever it was. We go to the meeting, and the chairman of the committee was Dr. Floyd Rittenhouse. So Dr. Rittenhouse is working down through the agenda, and he comes to this research center at Elmshaven. And he said, now this is Arthur White's, this is his item, so I'll turn it over to him. So Arthur White goes through this whole spiel, exactly what he had told me, why why it should be up there at Elmshaven and not up at the college. And he gets through it. He says, it's already shipped. It's going to be here in a couple of days. And, same spiel I'd heard. When he gets through, totally unbeknownst to me, I didn't know he was going to do this. He said, now, Jim has another idea. So he flips it over to me now, and I'm on. I didn't know I was going to be on. So I give my little speech that I had prepared to give to Arthur White a couple of days before. And when I get through, Arthur White said, I move it. And just like that, it went to PUC. Now, that's a side of Arthur. He had a little fun. He was having fun with me, for sure. But, some people thought he was so rigid. When he could see something that was better for the church, he knew that this was going to be helpful for him while he was doing the work on the biography. But once that was over, they weren't going to ship all the stuff back east, and it probably would just sit if it was at Elmshaven or get very little use.
Yeah.
So that was a thing about Arthur White that I respected, is he was not as inflexible as some people think. Now, I've seen the other side of him too, but we all can be stubborn. I can be stubborn. Just ask my wife. All right, you want to go talk about something else?
Well, we don't have long to cover the whole thing, but it would be unfortunate to not spend a little time talking about Adventist Heritage Ministries, or as it was originally back, Adventist Historic Properties. I would just want to take a few minutes for you to talk about that organization. I know our students at Andrews, graduate students, have either been to the village in Battle Creek, or I hope when there is a seminary heritage Sabbath each fall at the beginning of the year, that they will be able to come and go to that. And I know you went to every one of those seminary heritage Sabbaths up through your retirement.
Yep. I've been to all of them so far.
And so one of those places...
But of course we missed the last two, I guess, or one.
Yeah, because of this COVID problem. But I hope that it will start again soon, this next fall maybe. Or if things are possible, we'll have to see what happens. But so the students have some connection with Adventist Heritage Ministries. Talk a little bit about that. I don't know what you can share in a brief way. Maybe something about how important this was and how God led in its beginning and how he's used it maybe over the years. Just what comes to your mind on this?
Well, obviously a flood of things comes to mind because I've been with it from the beginning.
Right.
As far as how it came to be, there was a friend of mine who's now deceased, but there was a friend of mine. Well, he wasn't a friend at the time because I never met the man. But I received a phone call one day while I was working at Loma Linda, and it went something like this. My name is Duff Stoltz, and I've been told that you're the only person that could help me, and so I'd like to talk with you. Well, if you get a phone call from somebody you've never met who said, you're the only person that can help me, you're curious, You got my curiosity. And I said, well, what's that? What's going on? And he said, well, the Deacon John White house, James White's parents' house, which is right across the street from James and Ellen White's house, it's going to be torn down next week. The city of Battle Creek is going to destroy it because it's in such terrible shape. And I'm trying to raise the money to save that house. And I had gone to Battle Creek. I think the first time I was there was in 1960 as a teenager. And I know the next time I came back a few years later, several of the houses that I had seen on the tour in 1960 were not there anymore. This was before I was doing New England tours. I guess I'd done one maybe. But I wasn't aware of what was happening so much with the New England sites. But I did know that some of the sites were gone in Battle Creek. And I thought, we've got to protect a little bit of our history. But what do I know? I know nothing about this. I don't have a clue how to do it. And so what can I do? I can't do anything. I'm out in California, and this stuff's all in Michigan or in New England. But the Lord has ways of bringing people around that can help you when you don't know. Duff and I used to laugh sometimes and say, we were long on enthusiasm but short on knowledge. We both were gung-ho that we needed to protect these things. Neither one of us had a clue what to do. But God brought along people, and so we have the organization we have today where we own not just the 3 blocks in the village, but the Miller Farm and the Hiram Edson Farm, both in New York State, and Joseph Bates Boyhood Home in Massachusetts. And, we don't have time to go into some of the stories, but to talk about the impact. I wish I don't know how much time we really have, but I wish I could tell you about some of the impact. I remember on a tour that I was leading. I don't think this is one you were on, because we've led tours together, and I don't think
Yes.
this happened when on a tour where you and I were leading it together. But it was a pastor's tour, and there was this elderly minister who was, oh, elderly, he's younger than I am now. But he looked elderly to me at that time. Anyway, he was retiring, and this was about his last thing before he retired. And I'll never forget him sitting there in the Miller Chapel at the end of the tour, just as we were having the communion service. And with tears, he would say, if only I could have gone on this tour years ago, it would have made such a difference in my ministry. And I've seen young people, their lives change, college students, because I've been privileged to lead some tours for college students. And I've seen, there was one big fellow, he was physically large, and he broke down and just started weeping and praising the Lord that you've shown me that Ellen White was your prophet and this is your true church. He wasn't even an Adventist, but he was going to that particular school. I don't want to get too close because I don't know, he may see this someday. I don't know what he's doing now. I think he went into the ministry. So anyway, I've seen some miraculous stories like that, things that have happened that you can't just say, oh, these are historic old buildings. In fact, I've told people through the years, if you just want to restore an old building, go join your local historical society, because every historical society, almost in every community, is trying to preserve the oldest house in the city or the oldest church or the oldest something. So go join your historical society if you just want to restore buildings. But if you want to build faith,
Yeah.
join us in our mission of trying to preserve the story of God's leading in the beginning of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. It's an incredible story, and as I see it, these historic sites, all they do is they help the story come alive, because you have now a physical object in addition to hearing the story about the man, the woman, the boys, the girls, whoever lived at that site, or whatever the story is that you're telling about for that particular site. So to me, it's an incredible opportunity to share in a tangible way the story of God's leading in the beginning of the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Yeah, there's no question about it. And it becomes more important, and it supports the message. It's like the story and the message hang together. And when you can bring them together, it just makes the power even more incredible.
Well, I've started a lot of things in my career, I will admit, but Seminary Sabbath was not one of them. That credit for that goes to somebody else. But they're important because, and I'm glad the seminary does Seminary Sabbath every year up until the COVID thing hit, because the idea behind it is that when you're first starting your seminary education, you come there and you find out again, if you never knew before, you begin to find out, or you get reminded of the beginning of God's leading in this church. It's a prophetic movement. We're not just like the church down the street, the next church, as good as they may be, but they don't have what this church is privileged to have. So it reminds you of that, and then after you have been reminded of what we're all about and why, then you go and you learn how to make that message relevant to today's generation. You see how they did it. You hear stories on Seminary Sabbath about how the pioneers did it. Now you go out and you interpret that and you adapt that to making things relevant for us today. I think I hope that they don't ever stop it once they can start it again. I don't know what, future deans, they can do whatever, but I'm glad the current dean, the first dean that had it, and now the current dean has continued it. And I hope that whenever he goes to wherever he goes next, that his follower will keep it going. I think it's a beautiful combination of reminding us why we're here and what we're all about, and actually walking in the footsteps of the pioneers there in the village in Battle Creek, and then going back and getting educated about how we adapt this message and share it today.
And it's nice because the seminary students, you have the opportunity to not only go to Seminary Heritage Sabbath and see the village, but at least, and I miss this for about a decade, we had a study tour, which was a class that would go to the other sites, and not just the Adventist historic properties or ministry sites, but other sites as well. And I know that the plan is to continue
Of which 3 of them were Adventist historic
That's
property. I
right.
just wanted to throw
That's
that
right.
in.
We don't want to miss that. And those would be places we'd dwell, like at the Miller Farm and the Bates Home now, which is a wonderful new site that's building, and the Edson Farm, where you can understand better the development of the sanctuary message. And I am looking forward to COVID being over so that the professors, Adventist Studies professors at Andrews, the
Yeah.
seminary, can continue these tours. And I just want to say one thing as we're getting ready to close here, how much I appreciated your coming. I think except for 1 year, maybe it was 2, but at least maybe when you absolutely had no other alternative, but you were with all of the other tours that we had. You met us at the Miller Farm.
No, I think it was the Philippines. I had an appointment, and
Yeah.
some way I got the wrong date. And
But you came to each one of those tours, and I just appreciate so much. I want to say to you, in front of the seminary family, the support that you have given, not just as director of the White Estate, but also as a director of the White Estate, both personally as director.
well, I know I'm singing to the choir when I say this to you, but to me, you sat me down when you first came to Andrews, and I said, I don't need to keep coming to all this stuff now because you're there at Andrews. And you said, yes, you do. The White Estate needs to be represented. And the more I thought about it, the more it made sense to me. You cannot really do your ministry if you don't believe in Ellen White.
Yep.
We can have these discussions in the church about whether you have to believe in Ellen White and all that kind of thing. But if you're a Seventh-day Adventist pastor and you want to fully experience the blessings that come with being a Seventh-day Adventist minister, you need to be a strong believer in Ellen White. And anything that the White Estate can do, even if it's just the presence of the director, to let you know we care and there's a face behind that mailing address or that email address that you can contact, to me is important. And you sat me down and you talked to me pretty straight about that, and you convinced me. Now I'll tell you the same thing. You better listen to your own speech. Roll that tape again, brother. Listen to your own speech.
Well, in a way, this event, my being here at the invitation of Dr. Kaiser and Dr. Hernandez, is trying to follow in your footsteps on this.
Follow your advice through my footsteps and back to you.
Well, we only have a couple more minutes, and I think I appreciate how you've shared just these few thoughts on the importance of Adventist ministers, Adventist workers, really understanding Ellen White and appreciating her ministry and being personally blessed by it, and then being able to integrate her prophetic work, her writings in their ministry. And I think, in a way, this interview, in my mind, is praying that God will make that happen in just one more way for those who are leaders and will be leaders in the Seventh-day Adventist Church as pastors. And you go on from being pastors to leaders in other ways in the church. And those of you that are listening right now to this interview, God's going to use you in the future. And what happens in your life as it relates to your understanding and your appreciation of Ellen White and her prophetic ministry in connection with the Adventist mission and message will make all the difference in the world. And I just pray that God will particularly bless you. And I know
I want to close
you
telling
feel
my
this
favorite
way.
story. And that
Please, let's do.
I was asking Ellen White's oldest granddaughter one time, Ella, what her favorite recollection was. She was 33, I guess, something like that, when Ellen White died in 1915. And she said, well, that was easy. And I don't have much time, so let me abbreviate it. Ellen White was preaching, and on this particular Sabbath, she was talking about the matchless love of Jesus for all of us. And right in the middle of the sermon, Ella said her grandmother stopped, and she said she looked up as if she were looking right into the face of Jesus in heaven. And she said, oh, Jesus, how I love you, how I love you, how I love you. Yeah. That summarizes for me Ellen White's life. and that also for Ella was her favorite memory.
Yeah.
Oh, Jesus, how I love you, how I love you, how I love you. What a legacy we have to share.
Amen. Jim, would you, I started with prayer. Would you have a little prayer for us as we close for?
Sure. Our Father in heaven, I want to thank you for the chance that we had these few minutes to reminisce about Ellen White and the impact that she's had on our church. I pray that you'll be with all those who may listen to this video interview. Bless them, guide and direct them, and help them in their future ministry. Thank you, Lord, for hearing our prayer and for giving us the privilege, the opportunity to work with you towards finishing the work so Jesus can return. I pray in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. I pray that God will bless you as you continue with this Ellen White Issue Symposium, and it's been a great privilege for Jim and I to be with you today. God bless.